Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's PMI Friday webinar, Building a Resilient Supply Chain with Des Kelly. My name's Susanna, and I'm going to be running the Q&A desk today. So the Q&A button you can find in your Zoom toolbar, and we'll be using this throughout the presentation. So please do post your questions, and I'll put them to Des as we go through today. There will be a space at the end as well for any final questions. So today's webinar is being broadcast live on Facebook as well, and we're also recording this. So we will be sending you a link via email to the full recording, which has both the audio and the slides that you'll be seeing today. Finally, from me, before we get underway, I'd like to draw your attention to our upcoming Friday webinar schedule, which you can find on our website. That's on pmi.co.uk/webinars. At the end of the webinar, we'll also be sending everybody a short voice of the customer survey, and we'd be really grateful for your feedback, as well as any suggestions that you might have for future topics. So that's all I want to cover for the time being, and now I'd like to hand over to Des.
Thanks very much, Sue. So as Sue has said, my name's Des Kelly. I'm a partner consultant with PMI. And what we're going to be covering this afternoon in the 45 odd minutes that I should be talking is what is SCM, what is supply chain management? Now, there's been years and years of study in this, and there are more PhDs floating around on the subject of supply chain management. So we're only going to be able to touch just barely the surface, but we'll be presenting what is a model for supply chain management analysis, looking at the upstream and downstream views, and then also having a little look at a very recent experience of when something went wrong. So the objective that I have this afternoon with you guys, and I must say welcome to everybody from around the world. So whatever time it is on your Friday, you're very, very welcome. What we're going to cover, or I'm going to try and do during our 45 minutes, is to create and intrigue you all, not necessarily to educate, but to give you some insight, possibly into areas where you might not have looked before, and to share some of my learning from over the last 4 decades. And as I said, place a light in areas that might be helpful as your organization crosses the threshold into the new normal. So before we really get into this, what I want to do is to have a look at what is the definition of supply chain management, because it is different from wherever you go. The one that's on the screen at the moment is one which came from Chris Martin back in 2011, Christopher Martin, and his book, Logistics and Supply Chain Management, in its 4th edition. He said that supply chain management is the management of upstream and downstream relationship with suppliers and customers in order to deliver superior customer value at less cost to the supply chain as a whole. Now, that's quite a robust definition. I think it worked for me, but I found one which actually appealed to me a little bit more, and this one came from Aitken. And he actually suggested that a supply chain is a network of connected and interdependent organizations that mutually and cooperatively work together to control, to manage, and to improve the flow of materials and information from the supplier's end to end users. Now, I thought that was quite good, because he actually had the phrase connected and interdependent, because those of you that have joined us in our webinars over the last 5 or 6 weeks will know that we use this business system model, the one you can see in front of you now, and its key description is a network of interdependent components which work together to achieve the main aim of that system. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about what systems thinking is. There's you can jump on our website or go through many of the other webinars, but systems thinking is absolutely paramount, both within your own organization but also into the extended enterprise. So the next couple of slides I used last week and the week before just to actually get some positioning in place. So for those of you that joined us on those 2 occasions, you're going to see these again. And for those of you for which is new, this is some of the context that we will be looking at. So if you look at the system map and you look at the areas where the customers are going to be, after the the crisis we're currently in has gone, and we enter into the new normal, what will the state of mind of your customers be? What will they expect? What will they want? What will delight them? Because it's very likely it's going to be different. And it's important that you truly understand your customer, and that the customer becomes the central part of your thought process. Because offering what you've always offered in the past, in ways you've always offered it, to the customers who may now have a very different view on life, to customers who may value something very differently, will be the short route to becoming irrelevant. So the key thing here is that the customer in your supply chain management system has to become central to your thinking, has to become central to your thinking as your business, but in your supply chain management, it becomes even more important. Now, the new normal means that we must also understand in the same way how the world outside our organization has changed, because it will have done, how the world of our suppliers has changed, and that's going to be very relevant for this one, and how the world for everyone working in our system may have changed also. And then finally, the world that we live in today is very, very different from what it was 6 months ago. And in 3 months' time, will probably be different again. The things that were the norm in the past are very, very unlikely to be the norm today. Some of the questions for the SCM, the supply chain management, are going to be therefore, how will you know what's different? What are the new risks that are associated with this new world? And quite importantly, where are the new opportunities? Now, a perspective from someone who might know. Now, I took these slides from Tim Collins' presentation, which he presented at the Amazon Supply Chain Conference back in 2017. And he presented this slide, which he called Amazon's secret sauce. Now, I have no idea why he called it that. It's not the best of titles, but I liked the 4 bullet points, which is customer obsession, long-term thinking, innovation, and the last one, operational excellence. It is absolutely imperative for those organizations working in supply chain management that operational excellence becomes almost a byword. It becomes part of the DNA. And I'll try to explain why that is going to be so as we go forward. He then presented another slide, which is titled Amazon's Operation Playbook. I don't know what a playbook is, but I like the bullet points again. And Amazon's playbook, as he says, is more manufacturing than traditional retail operations. It extends lean and Six Sigma, they were, as he stated at the time. Continuous flow, the concept of continuous flow. Single piece versus batch movement. Now, when we visited, we PMI, we visited the Amazon warehouse here in the UK, or one of the Amazon warehouses here in the UK, at the start of the new year. And I must admit, I was very impressed by just the mindset and the approach they took to both the physical movement of the way their business operated, but also how they engage their people in the work of those people. So I actually came away with a changed view of Amazon. So this was quite interesting to see. The next point they stressed again was system thinking. System thinking. We've already talked about system thinking as being a key element of supply chain management. Optimization of bottlenecks. This is effectively removing the bottlenecks, understanding where they are and removing them. And then systematic defect reduction. And that means as you see something which is an assignable cause, remove it. So we have a model for supply chain, and this is one that I put together. So what we're going to do is look at this supply chain. Central to the supply chain will be your business. So in there, you can see the little icon of the system map. So your business as a system is central for your supply chain. To extend that, you probably go left in this case, where we're looking at tier 1, the first level of suppliers that we actually have. And you can go down tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Now, depending on the organization, you may go down more levels than that, you may have fewer. Now, one thing is, though, that whether you are physically moving material, you're a manufacturing process or you're a distribution process, or whether you're a service, industry or retail, you will have a supply chain. There will be a supply chain. You will have a supply network which is upstream. If it's services, it could be services that you're buying, it could be parts that you're buying, but you will have an upstream supply network. To the left of that, we just created this model with a few extra in. You may have wholesalers, you may have retailers, and then the customers at the end. You might sell directly to the customer. It doesn't really matter. It's only a model. Now, this becomes our extended enterprise, and the elements to the right become our distribution network, our downstream. Now, that's quite a useful model because it puts us central in there. And if we're going to understand the supply chain, we have to understand all of those dimensions. And so if we take one customer, for example, and if you watch now how that line progresses from right to left, from a couple of customers who want something, you can see how it went through the retailer, through the wholesaler, into your business. Your business required 2 tier 1 suppliers to respond to that requirement. One of those tier 1 suppliers required at least 3 tier 2 suppliers, and 2 of those required tier 3 suppliers. So you can see the complexity of how that network will build up. And it will be important to recognize that, because then we add the extra complexity of other products or other customers requiring slightly different things. And as you can see, the supply chain starts to become quite a complicated weave of interactions between various organizations. So that's the key point in this one here. Now, in any supply chain, we have aspects which are at the physical level, the material flow. We have aspects which are at the financial level. Now, most organizations focus on this area, becomes the be all and end all, the financial flow, the management of the cash. But there is also the information flow, how information flows from back and forth. So you notice with the material flow, it flows from left to right, the financial flow from right to left. Information flow flows both ways, keeping people informed of what's going on. And then there's the relationship level. Now, this is the relationship not just with people, between organization and organization, but also in technology, systems and processes that have to work together to ensure that the supply chain is actually up to date and working. So 4 levels: physical, financial, information, and relationship. So let's have a look at the SCM, the supply chain management upstream view. So, is managing the supply chain about managing stock level? Yes, but no also. Now, many people think that supply chain management is just about managing stock levels. It's not. It's much broader than that. We can look at the aspect that looks at possibly managing stock level and its impact on the organization. So this is just one lens you can look through. And if we're going to take operating working capital as one of the lenses that you might look through when you come to manage your supply chain. Now, working capital is defined as the cash that's required for running the daily operations, the ability for an organization to meet its short-term obligations and its production targets. Now, if you look at the actual graphic itself, and I'm going to actually use my cursor to actually point this out, part of the operating working capital will be payments due, the amount of payments you have to make to your selected suppliers. So that will create part of your operating working capital. It will be part of the raw material stocks that you have. So your raw material that's in warehouses or we're in warehouses between you and your suppliers will take part of the operating working capital. All of the inventory, the intermediate stocks, the just partly completed work you have either in your factory or in your office or on your system will become part of your inventory. That becomes part of the working capital. And then in the exiting warehouse, all the material you have there will be part of the working capital. Working capital then is extended because if you've got debtors or people who owe you money, then that will be added to the working capital. Now, most organizations try their best to minimize operating working capital. That's probably the wrong approach. The approach should be to optimize the use of your operating working capital. So I just want to give you that lens because I'm going to use it again in a moment. So operating working capital can be one of the lenses we have for testing whether or not our supply chain management system is working. And I just want to actually draw your attention to some of the disadvantages of having excessive stocks, which would lead to excessive operating working capital. So excessive stock may cover poor quality of manufacturing processes. It could hide all of the poor quality you have in your production processes, whether it's manufacturing or service provision. It may hide the supplier's poor delivery or service performance. It could hide excessive stock. Excessive stock can hide inefficient production processes. It can also hide skill shortages and inadequate manning, inadequate planning, inadequate organization of whatever system you're operating. In many, many cases, high stock hides transportation delays and inefficiency. Now, whatever the reason for excessive stock, it does actually make you feel safe. And that's what the danger is, the fact that excessive stock makes you feel safe. Now, our supply chain management is to allow us not to eliminate stocks, but to optimize the level of stocks that we have. And this next graphic I'm just going to use to actually just put a light in a little corner. Your business system, you'll see.
I'm
Sue.
so sorry to interrupt you. We've got a question in from Ian. What he says is, in your experience, I think this relates probably back to some of the slides you had a couple of slides ago. So in your experience, how much awareness do you think there is outside of purchasing teams of the hidden items that you're describing here?
That's an interesting one. I actually think, from my experience, Sorry,
this is related to excessive stock.
Related to excess, I think that's incredibly well known. I think it's incredibly well known. I think many organizations know that excessive stock, so if it's if excessive stocks, I think many organizations know about this. What they find difficult is doing something about it. So my experience is, you go to most organizations, they'll look and say, look, we've got far too much in our warehouse. We've got far too much stock lying around in here. We've got far too many emails in our system. So I think they're aware of it, but what they're not aware of is how the operational excellence process can help them get rid of that. And that's one of the key things that I thought was quite impressive with the Amazon slide, where they said operational excellence is one of the things they drive, because it will allow everybody not only to see and understand what this excessive stock might be, but also know how to do something about it. Knowing it's there and it's bad is one thing. Knowing what to do about it is entirely different.
Yes, and sorry, another question related to your comment about it makes you feel safe. You know,
Yes.
that for those organizations who didn't have sufficient stock at the start of this pandemic, you know, it's a difficult pill to have swallowed when they found that their supply chain, you know, couldn't deliver to them and they didn't have the stock.
No, I know, of course, and this is the art of supply chain management. Is having too much stock is a danger. Having too little is an equal danger, if not possibly more in some cases, because you definitely will be failing your customers in that case. At least the one upside of having excessive stock is you probably will be able to supply your customer what it is, but it has a lot of downside issues as well. So that's a very fair point raised by the delegate that's on there. So actually, thank you for raising that point, and thank you for actually stimulating my awareness. Of course, supply chain management is not just about limiting the stock to optimization levels. It's about ensuring that you don't run out also. It's about understanding all of that. What I was doing here is trying to demonstrate that one of the lenses you can look at, and this is the excess side, there is equally the negative side. So actually, can I just thank that person for raising that point? I think it was very timely and very appropriate, and quite a profound intervention. So thank you to that individual, whomever it was.
Thanks, Ted.
Okay, so lovely. If we look at this, so if you can imagine now your system map is in the middle, and remember this is our extended enterprise map of our upstream and downstream, and I'm just going to give you the lens on this one. If you put to drop in the middle of that the model of operating working capital for your business, and the failure to manage internally your ERP system so that you optimize your material, that might be one thing. But what happens when that extends back up to the supply chain? right the way back to your tier N, because that can be one of the most debilitating aspects of it. And have you ever stopped and considering how much of your capital is tied up in your supply chain? And I do absolutely acknowledge the point that sometimes it may be better to have too much than too little, particularly in these times, but neither is correct. That's the key point I would probably stress. Now, I can hear some people saying, yes, but Des, we have ERP. So is ERP the answer? Now, that might surprise some people. Yes, but no. Now, what I'm going to do is that we actually, there's some great studies. If you wish to go and study this subject matter, some great studies that you can go and read and some papers that you can pick up on. Now, this is one that I picked on. It's a few years older now, but nonetheless, the evidence within it is still relevant. And is ERP the answer? And the answer is, of course, in terms of managing stocks within your own organization, probably absolutely essential. Managing the supply chain in your organization. And the latest versions of ERP do lots of other things too, like customer relationship management, deployment mechanisms, labor management systems, and all those sort of things. They have lots of very, very clever additions in them. But this is one of in this paper, they highlighted some of the shortcomings that were in the ERP systems. And what they suggested is that they are insufficient extent into the extended enterprise. So they fail to go into the extended enterprise. So they don't cross organizational boundaries. They don't go from organization to organization. So when we look at what Aiken was talking about, our ERP systems don't do that interdependency between organizations. They have some inflexibility to the ever-changing supply chain needs. They sometimes, the world around you changes faster than the ERP system can be changed itself. Some of their lack of functionality goes beyond managing transactions. So it is about managing transactions, but what about managing relationships? What about managing communication and links like that? Sometimes your ERP systems go beyond that. And the other point they raised, and this was their final point, which actually builds up in two parts, is that their closed and non-modular system architecture is a problem. Now, the limitations of these generally go back to when ERP was first considered, and they were designed to integrate the various operations of an individual firm. So that one plays back to the first point, which says that ERP systems do not go across the extended enterprise. And the final bit in this, they said, is in the modern supply chain management, the unit of analysis has become a network of organizations, rendering these ERP products inadequate in their new economy. Now, what I would say is there are products, and the IT systems around today have the capacity to actually go across the extended enterprise. But one of the fundamental problems is management mindset doesn't support it. So one of the things I'd like to actually trigger in your heads here is that actually supply chain management is more than just about managing within your area and maybe tier one. It's about understanding down the whole area of it, the whole aspect of it. Because if as the delegate earlier on mentioned, that if a tier 3 supplier fails to present something, then or runs out of material, then your whole supply chain falls over. So it is a problem. So we're going to have a downstream view of the actual process itself, and I'm going to come back to the whole system. So this is the extended enterprise. And if we again take your organization, now it's really important to grasp this aspect of it, because any supply chain management system itself is predicated, its success is predicated on how well you know and understand your customers, how well you know and can predict what your customers want from you, how you can forecast and predict what comes from you. Now, if you've watched any of our videos online, you may know my view about forecasting, or some of the views I have about forecasting. In my view, there are only two types of forecast. The first is wrong, and the second, now this won't surprise you, or maybe it will, is lucky. So the two types are wrong or lucky. The question is, how will you become lucky more often? How will you become lucky more frequently? So there are
Des,
techniques. Yes, Suze.
sorry. So this, I mean, on that note, this seems a good point to cover a question which Mark has answered. Sorry, he hasn't answered, he's asked it.
I was going to say.
So his question is, how do you balance optimum stock levels with things like an unexpected pandemic? And I know it's similar to what we were talking about earlier, but I think in this context, it's maybe a good time to ask you about that.
Well, of course. I mean, I think that one of the things, and we'll come to it in a little moment, is about how do you risk manage? How do you understand the risks associated with your supply chain? Now, it's interesting, isn't it? But a pandemic has been identified nationally for the last 20 years or more as the most serious impact upon our nation's wealth. And we've all chosen to ignore it until now. And so I suppose really we've got to chalk that one down to experience and learning, because you could easily beat yourself up and say, well, how did I not guess that was coming? And how does the organization set itself up? So really it comes down to actually risk assessment and understanding how flexible you want your supply chain system to be, what you want it to be, what you want it to respond to. And that's a strategic perspective you've got to come to. And if you want to, and you say as a business, we want to make sure we're resilient to this aspect or to this aspect, it may mean a piece of you're going to have to invest into your supply chain more. You may have to hold more stock. You may have to give higher value to your supply chain so they can respond quicker, so that they are adaptable to your system or whatever it's going to be. And that will be within the contracts you generate between yourself and your suppliers. But that's a judgment. That's a strategic judgment. And strategy is all about making decisions. As long as those decisions are based on data, that's robust. So there is not one short answer to that. I think for as long as we have the opportunity to have businesses, we will be surprised on occasions.
Thanks so much, and thanks, Mark, for your question.
Okay, so the point there is that wrong or lucky? How are you going to be? So some characteristics then of forecasting and supply chains. Now, bearing in mind, forecasting what your customer wants is absolutely paramount so that you can actually structure your supply chain back up to your tier N, your tier 3, 4, however it's going to be. But we do need to remember that all forecasts, as I've suggested, have inherent errors. And these are due to assumptions or possibly poor processing. Short-term forecasts are generally more accurate than long-term forecasts. Well, that's probably a statement to the obvious. It's harder to predict something's going to happen in 12 months' time than it is next week. So that would be probably true. Aggregate forecasts are generally more accurate than individual forecasts, which is fine. So I'm going to sell this amount of product across these ranges. It's useful, but it may not be ultimately very helpful. So we may need to be able to get down into more discrete levels of data. The further up the supply chain you go, the further to the left on the graphic I presented to you, the greater the distortion of information, the greater noise there is that's competing for clarity with that information. So we just need to bear that in mind. So some options for developing a forecast solution. So depending on where you are, it could be qualitative forecasting. This is just relying on the judgment and opinion of people. And it may well be that's the only data you have. Is it wrong? No, it's the only data you've got. But we'll give you a little lens to look through in a moment as to how you might make better use of that. There's extrapolative forecasting, which is the use of time-ordered data to predict the future. That's statistical modeling in some cases. And then causal forecasting. This is where you do actually have a model. You build models based on what you know about your marketplace, what you know about your supply chain, and all the relative influences and interactions they go, and you can play those models. You still have to make a judgment at the end of the day, but causal forecasting is the last one. And then the three types that we have are short range forecasting, which are obviously typically up to about 3 months, but can span to about a year. And we use those for planning, purchasing, job assignments, workforce levels, that sort of thing. Medium range forecasts, typically 3 months to a year, but can go on up to 3 years. And we use these for sales planning, advertising, production planning, buying equipment, cash budgeting, labor, those sorts of things. And then long-term forecast, these are the ones that go 3 to 5 years out, maybe even longer. And we use these for when we're designing products, new products, or creating new plants, investing in R&D, or wherever those things are. So there are some horizons for forecasting, and you need to understand there's a multiplicity of these things as well. Now, I'm going to emphasize again, it's important that we understand what this forecasting is, because this forecasting is going to predict what our supply chain is going to be in the future. Get it wrong, and we have a risk of failing to satisfy our customers. So the choice of techniques you're going to be using will depend upon, will the gains of doing it one way or the other outweigh the costs? How complicated the relationship that must be forecast? Is the forecast for short run or long run situations? What level of accuracy is required? How precise do we need to be? Is there a minimum level of error? And I suppose, really importantly, what data is available onto which we can make that judgment? So what I would say here is that forecasting is a process, not an art. So if we wish to be lucky more frequently, then there are 4 things we need to be mindful of. The first thing is we must have absolute focus on the customer. We need to be able to understand what the customer needs, what they want, what they expect, what would delight them. And then we need to have a clearly defined process that everybody is following. We need to have correctly analyzed data that enable us to understand the facts behind the data. So we can only do that by looking at the data and analyzing the data correctly. And then finally, in this one, we need a method and a desire to improve the process. And if you were with me a couple of weeks ago, I presented this slide in a slightly different context, but this was what Deming said about data. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. The facts behind the data, and my experience has been over the last 30 years is, yeah, data is really, really important, but without correctly analyzed data, you're just another person with an opinion. So we need to be able to take that data and to be able to analyze it. When we look at forecasting, there's some granularity in forecasting. That granularity looks at the precision of the forecast. And the granularity will typically consider timeframes and quantity. So the granularity of time frame or the granularity of quantity. So the time frames could be daily, weekly, or monthly, depending on the granularity that you want. Quantities could be influenced by batch, annual, or even single part. And what we need to be able to recognize here is precision and accuracy are not the same thing. So when we're forecasting, precision and accuracy, if you look at the little dartboard we have there, the orange dots in the middle, you can see they're all tightly together around the bullseye. Now that's both precise and accurate. We were aiming for the bullseye, so they were precise and accurate. If you look at the yellow dots, they're away from the bullseye, but they're all tight together. Now that's precise and not accurate. If you look at the blue dots, they're not precise, but they are at least accurate. They are all very close to being the same distance away from what you were aiming at. And then the pink one is the dots that recite something that is precise, not precise, and not accurate, the worst of both worlds. Now, the question I would ask you is, how precise and accurate is your forecasting? And if it is not precise and not accurate, what's the implications on your supply chain management process? What level of noise does it generate into the system? Now, we have techniques by which we can actually assess accuracy and precision. We use the deviation from aim chart, and you could too. And the deviation from aim chart can be used, for example, sales forecast changes from month to month, largely because not all months have the same number of weeks or same number of days, and maybe the seasonal impacts in there as well. Planned completion times may vary in different processes. A more complicated product may take longer to do than a very simple product. So there will be differences in times and that way there. So what we really want to be able to do is to be able to understand how far away from our target were we. And the deviation from aim chart allows us to do that. If you want to know more about this subject, then click onto the website and follow the links into our Learning Hub, and you'll be able to pick up how you'll be able to get some more information about this. So what we need to be able to do when doing a deviation from aim on our forecasting is to identify what the aim is, observe the process and measure the actual value. So what was it we actually had? We subtract the aim from the actual value. That's the deviation then equals the actual value minus the aim. And in graphical form, it will look something like this. So what we're actually plotting is the difference between what we actually saw and what we said we would see. And note that could be either negative or positive. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. And what you do then is you simply plot that data on control limits and calculate control limits using an IMR chart, an individual moving range chart. Now, remember what we said, Deming said about without data, you've only got an opinion. And my addition to that is without data that's correctly analyzed, you've only got an opinion. So we really do need to correctly analyze it. Here's a couple of examples. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Now, these are absolutely real examples of deviations from aim using forecasting. So this particular one here is how long it was going to take from planned order to actual, so in raw materials. And as you could look at that one there and just point on the actual graphic itself, you see 0 here. If that red line was on 0, it would mean on average you're perfectly on target. Now we can see this one is slightly over target, but could be as bad as this or as good as bad as this. That's either way it's bad. So we know that the process itself gives us some variation, and every single time there's something that goes outside of the control limits, the person who's managing this control chart has actually identified what the assignable cause is, or what they believe the cause of the assignable cause was. Doing that will permit them to be able to understand how they can modify their process to better accommodate these changes in in activity around the supply chain. And again, so what is this one? Well, actually, this is reasonably precise. Reasonably accurate. It's around the 0 mark, but not too sure whether it's accurate. I think this one would probably satisfy the blue dots more than any other dot on there. So it's reasonably precise, but it's not very accurate. So I think I got that the wrong way around, but there we go. Here we go. So this one then is another one. And as you can see, this one here, again, 0 would be the target, but we can see the average is a long way from target. So it's absolutely not accurate. And it's very wide, so it's not precise either. So we've now got the pink dots. But this will allow us to actually learn and to be able to understand and improve our process as we're going. Now, someone actually earlier on raised the issue about what's the problem if you've got too little stock. And so what we need to be able to do is to be able to assess the risk in the supply chain. Now, I'm not actually going to do this little model against stock management, but you can do it just as well. So an approach, it is one approach, it's not all of the approaches. An approach to managing and assessing risk in the supply chain is to do this. Now, many of you will be familiar with value stream maps. Now, this is a value stream map in its basic construction. If you ever joined us on our Greenbelt program, you will have seen some of these slides that are emerging in front of you now. I'm not going to attempt to teach you what a value stream map is. Again, if you wish to know that, then just jump onto the website and the directions will take you to how you can gain access to understanding what a value stream map is. But a value stream map is quite useful because it gives us a lens to see the process that we're operating in a different way. So that's a value stream map, and it has all of the activities in it. So can you use a value stream map for your supply chain? Yes, you can. So here's a value stream map for your supply chain. And what we might be doing here, though, is asking slightly different questions. So I'm just going to go through this as how you could stimulate some awareness. So if this is your business in the middle, again, this is your tier 1, this is your tier 2, sorry. You could have your wholesaler and your retailer. So you can look both up and down to understand what is the value in the supply chain. If I look at this, I'm just going to explore. You can't see what the details are from that, so I'm just going to have a little look at them. Now, one of the things that you can see in here is that the data that we've got in there, we've got the inventory triangle at the top, which simply says 1. Is that enough or not? That's a judgment call for the business and to understand. But then you come down the list of things you've got. And so you've got average lead time, minimum lead time, maximum lead time, the number of operations the organizations have, the planned hours being used, 120 hours. 120 hours in that case, that sounds like it must be something like 3 shifts over 5 days. Is that a problem? Who knows, right? The defects, 1.9%, the rework, 1%. Now, the bottom 4 are the ones which actually are quite important. Financial risk. Now, this one's being identified as category A. I'll touch on that in a moment. CSR risk, corporate social responsibility risk, employee relationship risk, brand image. Now, you can add into there any determinant you wish. So if it's low stock outs, minimum stock levels, then write that in, make it into your value stream map. If that's a piece of data that's going to be valuable to you, then fine. If we look at those bottom 4, one of the things that's going to be critical with those, because we're going to build on it in a moment, is that they are operationally defined and they are standardized. So everybody understands what they mean and everybody uses them in the same way. So that is just the type of thing you can do on a value stream map. Now, you're not limited to the fields of data you can go searching. It's up to you what your requirements are. But let's have a look at this and using that again. So we can, using this one, for example, we can understand, those lorries generally indicate that there is transportation. So that enables us to assess the risk. So about drivers, insurance, there's a cost in those things. There's fuel, there's maintenance, maybe inner city restrictions, transport reliability. All those sort of things can be considered as part of your value stream map for your extended supply system. If we look at these two now, so go back to the tier 1, we can actually see here's tier 1. Their inventory triangle says they've got 10 in the triangle. If we look at that, so the inventory triangle there, their lead time, average lead time is 24 hours. The minimum lead time is 20. Well, it's all 24 hours. Now that might be good, maybe bad. I don't know. Their planned working hours are 40. That feels pretty much to me like maybe 1 shift on days only. The defects are 0. Do you believe that? I don't know. Possibly true. The financial risk is category A. The CSR risk is category A. The ER risk is category A. The brand image is category A. If we look at the one below it, let's have a look at the data that might emerge from that. All right. So let's have a quick look at something here. If we actually look at this one here, right, 168 hours, place 40. Now, 168 hours, I think if I was to calculate that through, that sounds like an organization that's operating 7 days a week, 24 hours. Is that wrong? Nope. If they've got the management system to cope with it and they can deal with it. You need to assess the data in light of the risk. It's not really a problem. Look at that, financial risk, category A. So no, financially they're fine. So if you've been in and you've studied and you've said, no, they can manage their management systems really good. They can cope with operating 7 days a week and 24 hours. They can do it and they're financially robust. That's fine. At this point, most of us would have walked away saying, happy days, this is a great supplier. But then we look at some of the other softer stuff, the CSR stuff, categorized as C. Well, what impact might that have on your supply chain? The employee relationship risk, categorized as D. What risk would that have on your supply chain? Brand image, what impact might that have on your image? So we want to be able to look and see and evaluate our supply chain in a lens. The value stream map is just a lens to allow you to learn how to see the data within your supply chain. So what can happen if you get your risk assessment wrong? Here's something. Now, for those of you, many of you that are operating outside the country, you may not have seen this, but this is a little story of a UK-based organization, an organization called Boohoo. And one of the things that, and the source from this I'm going to show you in a little while, comes from retail.eu. So this organization failed really to manage their supply chain, their second and third tier suppliers. And one of the organizations, now bearing in mind this organization is based in Manchester, and the organization that the problem arose in was probably less than 90 miles away in Leicester. And what a newspaper found out was that the organisation in Leicester was paying its people less than £3.50 an hour, It was breaching most of the COVID regulations. It painted a very, very nasty picture about this supplier. And look what happened to the 3-month Boohoo share graph. The fact that Boohoo paid no attention to the CSR aspect of a supplier created absolute mayhem for their share value. So this is one that's really worthwhile looking at as well. If we actually highlight a couple of elements here, as a result of that newspaper article, some of the large online platforms that Boohoo responded to pulled the plug, said, no, we're not going to do work with you. And that could have quite a significant impact on a very, very big business. So, and if you look at that last bit, celebrities and influencers who are important to the marketing of the label also started to distance themselves from the actual process. But what about their customers? What do their customers think? So I'm greatly indebted to a young lady who sent me these, and this is some of, if you can think that Boohoo are largely a very young person brand. So young people are very socially media aware. Not too sure that's the phrase you should have, but nonetheless, they're very media savvy. And this was the type of things that was appearing on Instagram. Boycott Boohoo. Now that would be seen hundreds of thousands of times. This would be seen many, many times. That would be seen many, many times. So not only did the companies like Next and also pull the plug, the customers started to get itchy as well. All because a supply chain was not managed or not understood well enough. So what was the impact on the business? So this I pulled last night. This is the Boohoo Group market cap. Now their market capitalization, this is the value of all of their shares that they actually have, is at 3.877 billion. Wow, that's pretty neat. But just have a look at the graph below. Have a look at this bit here, right? The downturn, not the downturn, sorry, the actual virus that we actually have, the problem we have with lockdown and everything like that, forced people to go online and just look at the jump in value of that company made, up to over £6 billion. But because they've received all this negative attention, they've been pulled off platforms, they've lost over £2 billion in share value because they failed to understand the impact of their supply chain. And I have to stress, not just at a material level, not just at a financial level, but at a relationship level. And that's one of the things they missed out. So does SCM matter? Supply chain matter. Here's another something that came out. Now this is how often do suppliers go into administration. This really surprised me. So if you look at the top of that, this assessment was actually suggesting that in this particular case, and this is according to the Constructor News Barometer, that the end of last year, and that was 2018, I think, and 19, I think it was, more than 3/4, 82% of organizations in the UK had seen one of their suppliers fall into administration. So a good proportion of organizations in the UK found their business go into one of their suppliers in their supply chain go into administration alone. Now that can have quite an impact, but I like the point that they actually put here, which I've highlighted and ringed around, and I've also brought up here, which is that if you don't know the risks that are associated with your supply chain and the risk of them potentially going into administration, how will you manage any associated disruption? So we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left on this particular one, so I'm coming to a close, but the Q&A will start shortly. Please ask as many questions as you like. Suze will be there and she'll make a list of them, and we'll try to get through as many as we possibly can. But let's make a summary of what we've talked about this afternoon. So key message is this one here. Supply chain management is a network of connected and interdependent organizations that mutually and cooperatively work together to control, manage and improve the flow of materials and information from suppliers to end users. And we had our little model. Supply chain management is a deep understanding of the upstream and downstream companies involved in your extended enterprise. Supply chain management is about understanding and mitigating risks, whether that's overstocks, understocked, failure to satisfy corporate social responsibilities. The risks are so many and so broad that you have to work that, I'm afraid, for yourself, but there's some obvious categories you can work in. Supply chain management is more than the movement and value of material, as you've seen from the Boohoo example. Finally, supply chain management is a process and a science. It's not an art. We require a close focus on the customer, clearly defined process that's followed, correctly analyzed data that enables us to understand the facts behind the data, and a method and a desire to improve the process. So hopefully that's put some lights into areas of supply chain management that you may have thought about before, but you may think about again. So now the opportunity is for questions and answers.
Thanks, Des. I've got a question in from Jeff. Jeff says that the value stream map view is very interesting. He asked, is it a widespread tool used by companies in your experience?
Value stream map is a tool that's used widely, yes. And yes, there is at least two of the organizations I associate with that demand, for example, when they are going to market and they're putting the RFQs out, the request for quotations of their tier one suppliers, that their tier one suppliers come back with a value stream map of their suppliers to show that they have studied the supply chain. And I think as we move into an environment where supply chain design becomes a technique, and actually where lots of organizations have professionals who are there to design the supply chain, I think you'll find that the value stream map becomes a more coherent way of looking at it. There are other tools that can be used, but I personally find that quite useful. And the reason I have shown it today is because where I've seen it used, it has demonstrated itself to be quite a useful beacon of light into areas which previously we maybe were either frightened to look at or just didn't have the insight to go look.
Okay, thanks, Des. And just to everybody on the webinar, we have a knowledge hub on our website, and there are videos on the knowledge hub. And I'm fairly confident, I know there is a video on there about about value stream mapping. And we also have a YouTube channel. If you want to know any more about either of those, then please just give me, drop me an email afterwards, and I'll be happy to tell you more about it. I've got another question in from Mark. Mark's asking, are value stream maps just a snapshot over time?
A value stream map, yes, is a picture of that particular point in time where we get insight. We can see what's going on. As soon as you've created the value stream map, it's out of date. It's a bit like your MOT on the car. You brought it in, it was MOT'd. Okay, that doesn't mean it's safe when you're driving it down the road. So yeah, it's a great point, Mark. It knows the answer. They are a snap point in time. They give you some insight. You use that data to inform your strategic decisions, but you've got to be aware that the world around you changes in a very dynamic and very fast way. And we also should be aware of that. So one of the rules is, I suppose, is how do you keep the data up to date and relevant?
Yeah, and I guess you would say it's about putting processes in place to do that, to review that.
I might have just said that, yes, if I thought about it at the time, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Des. Thank you, Mark. I've got one other question in, which is, have you ever found any reliable studies of supply chain forecasting accuracy?
I think what you'll find is that there are more studies out there than you can shake a stick at, papers about forecasting and supply chain management and techniques for forecasting. And people have earned PhDs on them, and therefore they must be valued, they must be good. But what I would say is, and this one here is for yourself, your own organization, is if you can start to understand some of the first principles. So for example, take a look at forecasting. How do I get forecasting to be accurate and precise? Design your own process and learn about that. Be your own teacher with your own environment, your own situation, your own context. That will teach you far more. Yes, you can get insight by reading lots of papers. I have to say, even for me to present this today, I have spent probably the last 3 weeks looking and reading papers to make sure at least I was, up to date and not talking in a very historical sense. And believe me, you can read so much, and you can read 2 papers and they would contradict each other. So my recommendation to you is this: understand your customer, map a process for how you will understand that process, that customer, and put methods in place so you can understand and analyze the data. Okay. If you do that, your learning will be far faster than any amount of reading you can undertake.
Thanks, Des, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. So just a reminder, as we're finishing now, we will be sending you a Voice of the Customer survey. We're really interested to see your feedback. We review them avidly, and we're also really interested to understand your suggestions for future webinar topics. So please do let us know about that. And we will be sending you next week a recording of the webinar. So do get in touch with us direct if you have any questions or there's anything you would like to chat through. You can see on the screen now the next webinars that will be coming up in July, and shortly we'll be sharing the webinar schedule for August as well. I wish you all a very good and a very safe weekend. Thank you very much.